This video is brought to you in part by Squarespace. Yeah, you're probably pretty familiar with that name by now on this channel, and that's no surprise. I love working with these guys, and I love their program. Long and short of it, if you're trying to get yourself a website online, Squarespace are the people you want to work with. I've personally always been intimidated at the idea of even starting a website, but these guys got me up and going within half an hour. I spend more time on character creators in video games. It takes you just a handful of minutes to get the basics, and they walk you through everything, no matter how intricate you want to get. They have a ton of preset designs that you can just get up and going at your heart's content, and it all looks super professional. And for those of you who want to get a little bit more bold and creative, you can go behind the curtains and tweak every little thing to your heart's content. If you're trying to put together a shop, portfolio, or whatever, they have tools that can track your growth, help you build an ad campaign, integrate with other social media platforms, and again, all of that is streamlined and easy to understand. It takes very little effort to get something clean and professional up in front of the world. Having your own domain name looks super sexy on a business card. And to make it even easier, if you head over to squarespace.com/gameapologist, you'll get 10% off your first purchase. Seriously, you could get this done in the time it takes you to watch this video. Thank you again to Squarespace for helping out, and on with the show. Welcome back to Sonic Speed Reading. Today we're finally going to be covering a little bit more of Archie Sonic. Specifically, I wanted to show the first issue featuring Knuckles the Echidna. I haven't done a proper Knuckles marathon in a while, and November is almost over, so I wanted to do something related to the guy. He's had a big year, he's in a movie, he had that short before Frontiers. It looks like we're finally getting his character back on track. So hey, I thought it might be fun to take a look at the comic that really gave him a lot of love. That is largely thanks to one infamous writer for Archie, but we'll get into all that in due time. Let's kick things off with Sonic the Hedgehog issue 13. This was originally released back in August of 1994. I remember being excited for this specific issue as a kid. I've said it many times before, but back in the day, I was desperate for any kind of game-related stuff to show up in the Western side of things, and having a brand new game, that being Sonic 3, released in February of that year, I was of course excited to finally see Knuckles in something outside of that game. And I gotta tell you, that wait was torturous for me. He wasn't in Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, he wasn't in Sonic Sat AM, and while yes, nowadays I better understand the productions of projects such as that, as a kid you don't know any better, you just want to see the cool new characters. And while we would get a whole bunch of Knuckles later on in Archie, this was still a very painful wait for me as a very, very little kid. Especially since this was the one comic I had missed. Yeah, I would pick up this book every single month, even if I wasn't the biggest fan of the stories or a lot of the secondary characters. And issue 13 was somehow the one book I managed to miss. It would be quite a little while before we would see the character again after this point, so yeah, it was a very frustrating time for little Nick. And it's not even like they advertised the character on the cover. As you can see here, it's just another generic Sonic cover that we were getting plenty of up to this point. But you might notice that they're using stock artwork for the character himself, as opposed to the more Archie-fied designs of the humans in here. That's because they used different art originally, as was shown off at the end of issue 12. And thank you for the Archie Sonic Wiki for actually having a higher def version of this design here. That's something people don't really talk about, but outside of this being the first appearance of Knuckles, this was actually the very first appearance of the full quill design of Sonic here in the States. At least in comic form. We had this stock art everywhere alongside the Mohawk. But from issue 13 going forward, the Mohawk was just gone. They would be sticking closer to the original Japanese Sonic design in the series from here on out. And while I do hold that Mohawk in a nostalgic place in my heart nowadays, back in the 90s, yeah, I was very happy to see that gone. It was such an ugly look for the character. And you might also notice that Pink Sally is still in use. Again, I really kind of took for granted just how early the first Knuckles story was in terms of Archie Sonic history. I largely associate the character with the more dramatic take that Ken would be using in the solo series. Anyway, yeah, that's enough rambling about the cover. Let's get to the story itself. As you can see from the very first panel, there is a lot to talk about in terms of adapting Sonic 3. We start things off as we did in the game itself, with Sonic on top of the tornado, which I don't even think that's what it's named in this book. And while it sticks fairly close to the game design, the coloring clearly is completely different. And also, unlike the game where the island is firmly in the ocean, we can see that that it is indeed floating, with some pipes protruding from the bottom here. And just below that, we also have the credits for everyone who worked on this particular issue, with the script, of course, partially by Ken Penders, but also by Mike Kanturovich. Wonder if I'm saying that right. Pencils by Dave Manick, inks by John DeGagostino. Again, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Letters by Bill Yoshida, colors by Barry Grossman, with editor Scott Fulop and managing editor Victor Gorelick, and editor-in-chief Richard Goldwater. I don't actually know what some of these folks do. Below that, we see that this particular comic is dedicated to their inspiration, Jack Kirby. I thought it was very strange that they would mention him here of all places, so I decided to do a quick Google search to see when the man died, and sure enough, yeah, Kirby had passed away in February of that year. Same month that Sonic 3 released in the States, which is also likely when they began work on this particular script. So yeah, while that was weird, at least at first glance, it makes a lot of sense. But carrying on, yeah, Sonic and Tails are obviously surprised to see an island floating in the sky, with Tails wondering why it's doing that, and Sonic assumes that a Chaos Emerald is probably what's causing that. And yes, that is what they are using instead of the Master Emerald, another drastic change from the game lore. But keep in mind, this issue did come out before Sonic and Knuckles, and who knows how privy the comic team was to any of that stuff in terms of what Sonic team was cooking up. Anyway, as Sonic and Tails approach the island, we see a familiar fist waving in anger towards them, saying, "A couple of unwanted guests. Time to roll out the unwelcome mat." And in true Archie fashion, they literally roll out the unwelcome mat, as Knuckles, I guess, let off a rocket holding a literal mat that says unwelcome, which takes out the tornado, but thankfully, Tails grabs a hold of Sonic to escape the wreckage. They immediately assume that the attack was from Robotnik. When they make landfall, they begin to make their way across the island, hoping to find another way off of it. But they're immediately set upon by what Tails calls a batter blimp, that firebombing enemy from the very first level of Sonic 3. It shoots off bombs and fire every which direction, almost hitting Sonic, who manages to deflect the fire shot with, I don't know if it's that quick insta-flash effect that you got from Sonic 3 or the electric shield. Either way, that doesn't make sense because the fire shield would be the only thing that would deflect it. Whatever the case is, Sonic and Tails dive into a body of water nearby, with Sonic saying, "No telling how long the effect will last. Better get our feet wet while we're still able. Hit the drink, Tails." To which Tails responds, "But it isn't even Saturday night." Drinking jokes in our Sonic comics, you gotta love it. Underwater, they're immediately in Hydro City, or Hydrocity Zone, with Sonic pointing out that his bright, shiny new shield has fizzled out. Again, not sure where that came from. They never explain it from here. And we see some basic level layout from the game itself, with Sonic grabbing onto poles, crashing through walls, and the comic telling you to help Sonic along by pushing the buttons on your Sega Genesis. Yeah, if you guys don't like meta humor, I hate to tell you, there's a whole bunch of it back in early Archie. And what's worse, the comic blames you for Sonic not being able to hold on against the suction of the water. And as they're pulled down the tunnel, they black out, waking up in a pitch dark room, until a spotlight turns on. And out steps, for the very first time, Knuckles the Echidna. Quite the presentation. Knuckles exclaims that he is the last of the Echidna and the guardian of the Chaos Emerald. Again, you're just gonna have to go with it. This was really early on. He goes on to say that his pal Robotnik told him that Sonic and Tails were planning on snatching the jewel, and he doesn't take kindly to trespassers on the floating island. Again, they didn't call it Angel Island, called it Floating Island. And he hates would-be thieves even worse. And with that, part 1 ends. Yeah, they would do these old issues in parts, and there was a lot that happened in just 5 pages so far. But let's keep going. We then shift perspective over to Robotnik and Snively, watching everything from a giant monitor. They do confirm that a Chaos Emerald is indeed keeping the island afloat, and Robotnik plans to use it to recharge his hovercraft. Snively also confirms that Robotnik has indeed tricked Knuckles into thinking that Sonic and Tails are the bad guys here, which is fairly standard for the original game's story, but it is a little bit strange in terms of Archie lore, considering that Robotnik generally relies on the roboticizer to get things done, and that's something they actually will address a little bit later in this book. Anyway, back to Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. The Echidna says that this proves Robotnik was right. How else would these guys know about the Emerald? To which Sonic says, "You just told us on the last page of part 1. Can you believe all this meta humor before we even use the word meta all the damn time?" Knuckles says that Echidnas are firm but fair, so he's gonna give these two a chance to get off off of his island. He's gonna give them a 10-minute head start before he comes after them. And if they're not gone by then, he will take them out. I'm gonna assume that 10-minute head start is a reference to the time limit in the acts of the original games. But yeah, anyway, Sonic and Tails zoom off, not in hopes of escaping, but to instead prove their innocence. And we can also see a reference to Gotham City and Batman, and you just have to deal with it. You can't take anything too seriously in these old books. Robotnik then calls Knuckles, wondering why he felt it necessary to release the two. And Knuckles tells him to chill out, saying that Robotnik should take care of business, while Knuckles gives those guys the business. God, I love this writing. From there, communication is cut off, and a frustrated Robotnik complains about how much he hates free will. Once again, as I stated before, he usually relies on robotization to get things done, but for whatever reason, he's not done that with Knuckles. Maybe he just doesn't have the means to while he's trapped on the island. Maybe Knuckles is just too tough for him. I don't really know. But whatever the case is, Robotnik decides to move up his plan's timeline, as he turns over to a crab meat and a random SWAT bot asking if they had accomplished their job. And it turns out they did. They have captured the island's Chaos Emerald. I keep saying it, these random badniks are some of the best Robotnik lackeys we've ever seen in any of the canons. And these guys actually get stuff done. Good for them. Meanwhile, Sonic and Tails continue to swing around the island while Knuckles watches them leave. He takes a shortcut towards the shrine of the Chaos Emerald, which is just a pile of rocks randomly sitting in a field, and surprise, surprise, it's gone. Knuckles turns around and sees that Sonic and Tails are just arriving here, so clearly they're not the ones who took it, and realizes that he had been tricked by Robotnik, who we turn our attention back to as he prepares to leave in his hovercraft. But before he does, the emerald is snatched out of his hand by who else? Sonic, who is here with Knuckles, and the two of them quickly take out the remaining SWAT bots and escape the hovercraft before it takes off. Robotnik, making his escape, once again curses the Hedgehog and now the Echidna too. And as you can see from this panel here, it looks like the island is much closer to the water. Maybe that was just awkwardly drawn, I don't know. And hey, it turns out while Sonic and Tails were unconscious, Knuckles had actually grabbed all the pieces to their busted plane, which Sonic quickly puts together. And now, with the understanding that Knuckles is an ally, not an enemy, the two take off back to Knothole, Knuckles waving them on, saying that he has a funny feeling he hasn't seen the last of those mugs. And I like this little end piece here, asking, is Knuckles friend or foe? Sonic and Tails would like to know. I think we clearly established that he's not a foe, so sure, whatever, weird time to ask. But yeah, guys, that's the very first story featuring Knuckles in terms of the Archie canon. It's a very simple, silly little story. And if it feels like I rushed through everything, well, that's because the comic did itself. This isn't even the full issue. We have a whole secondary story that takes place after the first one. And it's a fairly hefty one too. It features a crazy new machine which can roboticize from the air, which is something the Death Egg would do later on in the series. They all end up in space. Apparently there are 100 moons surrounding Mobius. It's just wild. It's just crazy to me that a character as important as Knuckles is not played up more than what we get here. And what's even weirder to me, they wrap up the whole enemy angle before the actual game that does it even released. So if you had played Sonic 3 but you had not played Sonic and Knuckles, this kind of spoils a little bit of the story. I'm pretty sure the American manual of Sonic 3 says that Angel Island is held aloft by a Chaos Emerald or something like that, but clearly that was not the direction they were going to take in Sonic and Knuckles. So I don't know if things changed midway through development, or they just didn't get all the information over to the comic team or Sega of America. It's not like Sega was famous for communication between those two major branches back in the day. And yeah, as you could see throughout all of this little story, it's not exactly consistent with what is presented in Sonic 3 by itself. It really does feel like the writers only got to play a demo of this and then crafted what they could from the story. And to be fair, that's what a lot of early Archie feels like when it comes to adapting the games. And we're going to be taking some more looks at stuff like that fairly soon. As far as the infamous connection between Ken Penders and Knuckles, yeah, it turns out Ken, even very early on, this is one of his very first stories he would work on with Archie, was connected with Knuckles. He wasn't the only one on the script, obviously, but I can better understand his connection with the character as he was one of the very first people on the comic team to get a chance to tell stories related to him. And considering all the intrigue that would come with a floating island in the sky, being the last of your species, a mysterious past, yeah, that is a great place to jump off of if you want to tell some wild stories, especially when the company who owns the character doesn't really care what you do with them. But yeah, even removed from the game canon or what we know would come later on with the character, the story by itself is Nothing special, but truth be told, not a lot of early Archie was anything special to begin with. Again, this is issue 13. We've only had 1 year under our belt in terms of the stories, which up to this point were very silly and very episodic. Very slowly, and with the introduction of Knuckles here, we would see that change, for better or worse. Of course, to a lot of people, this doesn't hold a candle to what they did over in the UK with the Fleetway version of Sonic 3, and honestly, I can't blame anyone for that. They did a lot of wild stuff that I can't wait to get into myself. I've not fully read through all of it, and I certainly didn't as a kid since I was stuck with what I had here in America, but we'll get to all that soon enough. For now, yeah, that was just a quick look at the very first story featuring Knuckles in the Archie Sonic canon, and next time we're going to show off how Archie adapted Sonic and Knuckles. So until then, thank you so much for watching. I want to give a huge shout out to the patrons who support the channel, especially the guys giving at the $5 tier. Normally I do a shout out for every name on that list, but it is a lengthy list and I'm so unbelievably thankful for it, but I'm still recovering from a throat virus, and last time I did a long readout, it completely wrecked my throat. So we're just going to cut it off here, give my throat a bit of a breather, and we're probably going to be skipping it for the next couple of speed reading episodes. So thank you guys so much for understanding and thank you for your patience, but we'll get back to it once my voice has fully come back and my throat doesn't feel like I'm swallowing knives. But yeah, until next time, toot toot Sonic Warriors.